What if Mickey Mouse wasn't the cheerful icon you thought you knew? These 3 chilling true stories in this video uncover a twisted, terrifying side of the beloved mascot that will leave you haunted. Watch closely. This is darker than you ever imagined, and the eerie encounters will send shivers down your spine. Before we begin, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss more chilling stories like these. Now, let's get started. It was the summer of my early teens when my parents and I decided to take a vacation to New York City. The excitement was palpable as we set off on a journey to one of the most iconic cities in the world. We rented an Airbnb in Manhattan and spent the first few days enjoying the sights and sounds of the city. But one particular night stands out in my memory. The night that changed my perception of Times Square forever. The adventure begins. It was an ordinary evening when my parents and I decided to visit Times Square, the epicenter of all things touristy in New York City. The streets were teeming with people, flashing billboards, and the vibrant energy that is unique to the area. I'd seen Times Square in movies, but nothing could have prepared me for the chaos and excitement of being there in person. There were tourists, locals, street performers, vendors, and even people dressed up in costumes. The usual hustle and bustle was a sensory overload, but something about it was thrilling. Since I was old enough to have a phone, my parents didn't mind me wandering off a bit on my own as long as I stayed within the general vicinity. I decided to explore on my own, snapping pictures of things that caught my eye and taking in the scenery. The creepy Mickey Mouse. As I made my way through the bustling crowd, something unusual caught my eye. A figure dressed as Mickey Mouse. But this wasn't the kind of cheerful, lovable Mickey that you'd expect to see at Disney World. No, this costume was something altogether different. Something off. Something that made me pause and take a second look. The costume's face was distorted, its features twisted in a way that made it look less like the beloved character, and more like a strange, eerie imitation. The eyes, dark and hollow, stared out from behind the mask, and there was an unsettling quality to the entire figure. It wasn't the playful, welcoming Mickey I knew from cartoons and theme parks. It was wrong. There was something deeply disturbing about it. For a moment I felt a rush of unease, but I quickly brushed it off. It was just one of those quirky street performers New York is known for, I reasoned. The city was full of eccentric characters, and this one was simply a part of the atmosphere. Still, something about the figure stuck with me, lingering in the back of my mind as I continued to walk through the crowd. As I passed by, I couldn't help but glance over at the Mickey one more time, and that's when things took a strange turn. The costume's eyes, those unsettling, lifeless eyes, locked with mine. It was as if he knew exactly where I was and who I was. The connection felt unnervingly intentional, like I had become the focus of his gaze in a sea of strangers. My pulse quickened, and an icy chill ran through my body. It wasn't just a casual glance. It felt predatory, deliberate. At that moment, my instincts screamed at me to look away, to break the connection and move on. But I couldn't. It was as if the figure's gaze held me captive, keeping me frozen in place. My heart raced, my breath shallow. There was something about the way he stared at me that felt so wrong. It was no longer just a costume. It was something darker, something that made my skin crawl. Eventually, I forced myself to look away, my feet moving faster as I pushed through the crowd. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't being paranoid, that something was off about that encounter. Something about that Mickey staring at me with those hollow eyes would stay with me long after I left the crowd behind. The confrontation. Just as I was about to turn around and shake off the unsettling feeling, the person in the Mickey costume began charging toward me. I froze, unsure of what was happening. He reached me in seconds, and then without warning he started screaming in my face. "Pay me for taking a picture," he shouted, his voice harsh and accusatory. Confused and startled, I tried to tell him that I hadn't taken any pictures of him. But he didn't listen. His grip tightened and he yelled again. "Pay up! You took a picture, now you owe me $20. I was taken aback by his aggression and quickly tried to pull away, but his hands were like iron clamps around my wrist. I began to panic. The situation was escalating and it seemed like he wasn't going to let me go without a fight. Despite my struggles, he kept repeating the demand, his words growing more frantic and loud. Finally, after several seconds of desperate fighting, I broke free from his grip and bolted. The crowd parted, and I sprinted away from the crazed Mickey Mouse without looking back. As I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him standing there staring at me. His eerie presence burned into my mind. The aftermath. I eventually found my parents, who were still taking pictures of the towering skyscrapers nearby. I didn't want to worry them, so I kept the bizarre encounter to myself. I told them I was just ready to head back to the Airbnb, and after some convincing, my dad called for an Uber, and we headed home. But the weirdness didn't stop there. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of that creepy Mickey Mouse. I kept tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Every time I was about to drift off, flashes of the disturbing mask would invade my mind, startling me awake. The whole encounter had left me on edge, and I couldn't seem to escape the feeling that something wasn't right. The nightmares begin. Later that night, when everyone else was asleep, I started hearing strange noises in my room. At first, I thought it was just the creaks and groans of the old building settling. But as the noises grew louder, I started to feel a sense of dread creeping over me. It wasn't long before I realized the sounds weren't just the building, they were coming from inside my room. Suddenly, my heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the corner of my room, was the same creepy Mickey Mouse. His face was even more terrifying in the dim light, and his unblinking gaze made my blood run cold. I froze in place, too afraid to move. Was this a nightmare? Had I fallen asleep? Or had the man in the costume somehow found his way into the Airbnb? The chase. Before I could process what was happening, the Mickey Mouse figure lunged toward me. He grabbed me by the collar and once again screamed in my face, "Pay me now! You owe me for taking my picture." I was paralyzed with fear. "Help! Mom! Dad!" I screamed as loud as I could, but my voice was shaky, and the words barely escaped me. The Mickey Mouse figure shoved me away, and before I could regain my bearings, he turned and ran out of the room. I ran down the stairs, panicked, and woke my parents. They rushed to my side, asking me what was wrong. Through my hysteria, I explained everything that had happened, and my dad immediately called the police. The Mickey was gone by the time they arrived, but officers later found him a block away and arrested him. The whole incident was over in a matter of hours, but the emotional scars remained. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep without reliving the terror of that night. The image of Mickey Mouse haunted my dreams, and I was left with a deep, unsettling fear of costumes and mascots. The investigation. Years later, I would learn that my unsettling experience with the man in the Mickey Mouse costume was not an isolated incident. The story of a man harassing tourists in Times Square, dressed as Mickey Mouse, had made headlines, confirming my worst fears. The man, according to reports, had been aggressively accosting victims, demanding money from them by claiming they owed him for photos they had never taken. The tourists, confused and intimidated, were often caught off guard, unsure of how to handle the situation. His behavior had been erratic and hostile, with accusations of foul play and threats if people refused to pay. The man's outbursts were what ultimately led to his arrest. But by the time authorities intervened, the psychological damage was done. The reports described how he would target unsuspecting tourists, particularly those who were enjoying a day out in the bustling streets of New York, completely unaware of the danger lurking in plain sight. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as I read the news articles. The man in the Mickey costume that I had encountered could very well have been the same one terrorizing visitors, and the thought made my stomach turn. It made me wonder just how many others had crossed paths with the same deranged individual. How many people have encountered Mickey Mouse in a way that no one should ever have to? How many had felt the same uneasy tension, the same creeping sense of danger, as I had when I found myself face to face with that distorted version of the beloved mascot? The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that my experience was just one of many, and not the worst one by far. What had started as a strange, creepy experience had far deeper implications than I had ever realized. It wasn't just a bizarre encounter with a street performer. It was an encounter with a man who had lost his grip on reality, using a beloved cultural symbol to manipulate and frighten others. I realized that the fear I had felt that day wasn't just the result of a distorted mascot, but of the very real threat posed by someone who had no regard for the comfort or safety of others. My experience wasn't just an odd encounter. It was a glimpse into something darker, something that, in hindsight, seemed all too real and all too frightening. A strange encounter at my birthday party. A few years later, I found myself facing another unsettling encounter with a person dressed as Mickey Mouse. This time, it was far closer to home. It was my birthday, and my parents had planned a surprise celebration to make it special. They had always gone all out for my birthdays, but this one seemed particularly elaborate. When I walked into the backyard, I was greeted with a Mickey Mouse-themed cake, colorful decorations, and a cookout with family and friends. It was a festive atmosphere, filled with laughter and the smell of grilled food. At first, I didn't think much of it. For years, I had begged my parents to take me to Disney World, but for one reason or another, it had never happened. So when they told me that they had arranged a special Mickey Mouse mascot to attend the party as a surprise, I was thrilled. It seemed like the perfect way to bring a bit of Disney magic to my home. The mascot was there, cheerful and lively, mingling with the guests, posing for pictures, and playing games with the kids. Everything seemed normal at first, just another fun, light-hearted birthday party. But then, as the day wore on, something began to feel off. The mascot's movements were jerky, awkward, and mechanical. It wasn't like the friendly Mickey I had imagined, with his warm smile and playful antics. This one moved strangely, almost as though it were being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how to make it seem natural. And his eyes, those eyes, had that same unsettling quality I remembered. There was something hollow behind them, something that didn't belong. I noticed that the mascot would frequently stare at me for too long, almost as if it was watching me specifically, and a chill ran through me each time our eyes met. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe the person inside the costume wasn't used to being a mascot. But the more I observed, the more I started to feel uneasy. The figure seemed to be deliberately staying near me, following me around the party as if it knew I was uncomfortable. My heart began to race, and I had to force myself to smile and keep up the charade. But the fear I felt was undeniable. I couldn't shake the feeling that this Mickey Mouse wasn't just a part of my birthday party. It was something darker, something I couldn't explain. The creepy mascot. As I walked into the backyard, I saw the Mickey Mouse mascot standing in the corner of the yard. Unlike the cheerful Disney version of Mickey, this costume looked worn out, cheap, and unclean. It had stains on the costume, and its face was lifeless as if it had seen better days. I tried my best to ignore it, but the mascot's presence was impossible to shake. It wasn't just the suit. It was the way the character seemed to linger, watching me more closely than was comfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The more I tried to focus on the party, the more I felt like I was being watched by the Mickey Mouse. My family and friends seemed completely oblivious to the oddness of the situation, and this only made me feel more isolated in my discomfort. The unsettling behavior. As the night wore on, the mascot continued to hang around, pacing slowly around the backyard and watching us play games and eat. At some point, I even noticed the mascot staring at me from across the room, which made me feel uneasy. I was beginning to wonder if it was just my anxiety playing tricks on me. But the more I observed him, the more I started to believe that something was off. At one point, the mascot disappeared from view. I assumed he had gone inside, perhaps to join the adults in the basement. I was relieved to have a moment of peace, but little did I know that the worst was yet to come. The bathroom incident. A while later, I got up to use the bathroom. It was then that the terror truly began. As I entered the bathroom, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned around, half expecting it to be one of my friends playing a prank, but to my horror, I found that the Mickey Mouse mascot was standing there, watching me as I used the bathroom. I froze, my mind racing in disbelief. What the hell was going on? This wasn't a harmless costume, this was a person, a grown man, stalking me in a way that made me feel violated. I shouted at him, demanding that he leave, but the mascot only stared at me in silence. He didn't speak, nor did he move. Eventually, I bolted out of the bathroom and ran to my parents, telling them what had happened. They dismissed it as my imagination running wild, but I knew what I had seen. The unforgettable memory. That night, as I lay awake in bed, my mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The unsettling images of the man in the Mickey Mouse costume kept swirling in my thoughts, refusing to leave me alone. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that he was still somewhere in the house, silently watching me from the shadows. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the wind outside made my heart race, each sound amplifying my paranoia. I kept my eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, half expecting him to materialize out of nowhere. The memory of his lifeless, vacant stare haunted me like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. It wasn't just the unsettling appearance of the costume, it was the way he looked at me, the coldness in his eyes that felt almost inhuman. It was as though he wasn't a person at all, but a thing, a puppet that had lost all sense of warmth or kindness. His gaze felt like it burned right through me, invading my thoughts and making my skin crawl. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, and it felt like I was reliving it over and over again. Despite the years that passed, the fear never truly dissipated. That night had left an imprint on me so deep that I could never fully shake it. The idea of someone hiding behind a mask, lurking in places where they shouldn't be, became a source of constant anxiety. The memory of that Mickey Mouse figure haunted me. Its image burned into my subconscious. I could no longer look at a person in costume without feeling the same deep sense of dread that I had that night. Even today, whenever I see someone dressed as Mickey Mouse, that same sense of unease floods me. My heart skips a beat, and I feel an overwhelming urge to turn away or move quickly past the figure, as though avoiding it might protect me. The fear that once seemed irrational now feels so real, so tangible, that I can't help but wonder if that unsettling encounter was something more than just a bad memory. It was a warning, one that I would never forget. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, like, comment, and subscribe for more spooky content. Stay safe, and see you soon.